Hey folks, this is Levi. Glad you're joining us on another installment of our study on the Sermon on the Mount. I want to begin today by letting you in on a little preacher's secret, something we all have in common. See, we all have our favorite things to preach about and then things that are our least favorite things to preach about. Some of those are very specific to the person, and then some are just culturally uncomfortable topics that from time to time we avoid because they're easier. So for me, I like preaching about God's plan for redemption. It includes justification, sanctification, and redemption. I love to preach on themes of Christian worship and assembly, and I love to sing together and tell the stories of those songs. Those are the things that I enjoy and things that I can lean into if I'm choosing the topics and the nature of the lessons that I'm going to deliver. When I'm preaching topically, I'm free to preach my own favorites, and it's easy to preach those things that aren't high on my list. And this is why I discipline myself to teach and preach textually, so that I can do my best to speak the whole counsel of God and the very words of God. So this series of preaching through the Sermon on the Mount, it gives me things that I love to preach about, and there are also some topics that are a little less comfortable because of the culture we live in. So I told you the last time we were together that in the following segments of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus would be speaking very, very directly to the human condition and painting the picture, laying out the road, straight up teaching us how to bow our knee of the human will to life in the kingdom under the reign of the benevolent High King of heaven, how to live God's way. Our topic today, the uncomfortable one, is sex. Sexuality is a wonderful gift that God has given to us, but our culture seems to run in one of two opposite directions whenever the word is mentioned. We either revel in it gratuitously, which is why most of the advertisements and entertainment on television and on the internet depict half-dressed models. On the other hand, we completely avoid it, and we paint the entire discussion with an unhealthy dose of shame. Folks, there's an entire book of the Bible, Song of Solomon, that depicts the intimacy of lovers' physical relationship together. We really need to destigmatize sexuality and the word that the Bible and the church ought to have to these things. I suppose that it's because the church has been silent about sex for so many generations that we have failed to inform the conscience of the world in which we live on matters of sexuality. But we dare not abdicate our God-given role of being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, staying silent on things like sex, marriage, and other personal topics, when the Bible is replete with commandments, with examples, with wisdom of what these things can be when they're practiced God's way. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4 says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." So with that, we turn to our text in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 27. The Bible says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go to hell." Adultery and fornication, these are the words of the day. They're two words that the Bible uses to describe sins of a sexual nature. Now there can be some quibble for the Greek geeks out there as to some technical definitions of these words, but generally most people can work within the following definitions. That fornication is about all sexual immorality, all sexual activity that takes place outside of marriage, and therefore without God's blessing. Now, this includes premarital sex between two people who are dating, maybe even people who are engaged. Adultery, more specifically, is sexual activity that takes place where one or both parties is married. They're just not married to one another. And this is sexual infidelity to the marriage that we're a part of, or cheating. So Jesus said, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Well, where would you have heard that? In the Ten Commandments, of course. You remember our previous section, Jesus began with, you've heard that it was said, you shall not murder. And then he goes on to say, but if you're hiding behind that, if you say that I can hate my brother, I can call him all sorts of names, I can think about him however I want to, as long as I don't go so far as to actually murder him, I'm okay. Well, if that's the way you think, you've certainly given a foothold to lots of anger in your life. And they were using this seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, in the same way, hiding behind it by saying, look, I haven't actually committed adultery. Oh, I've lusted, I've looked, I've wanted, I've thought about, and I've daydreamed. But I haven't gone so far as to actually commit the actions of adultery, so I'm okay. Just like in the previous section, there's nothing wrong with this commandment. You see, Jesus isn't just dismantling the old to give them something new. He's just clearing off all of the crud, all of the buildup that their traditions have allowed them as justifications to get around what God had intended from the beginning. So there's nothing wrong with the commandment. In fact, it's still as true and noble today as it was when it was very first given to Moses and written down on tables of stone. But you know, we can fool ourselves into some kind of surface level righteousness. Righteousness in name only, if we tell ourselves that just because we haven't committed the action of adultery, that our hearts are pristine and pure. It's not just don't commit adultery, but like any marriage counselor today will tell you, a person in a healthy marriage doesn't wake up one day and by the end of that day find himself in bed with somebody who's not his spouse. So he doesn't go that the action of adultery is the first thing that happens. There's a heart and a mind that lead up to the body's actions. The action of adultery is the culmination of many things. But those many things are the impurities which expose the intentions that we're carrying around in our hearts. And so Jesus says it's looking, but it's looking with lustful intent. It's not just the first glance or the image that pops up on our screen before we can look away. Now, this is the second, the third, and the fourth lingering look. It's the pausing on or replaying of a certain sultry scene that excites the imagination. It's the $12 billion industry that pornography has become in our high-speed internet age. The danger here is just as real on step one of this path as it is all the way at the end. So Jesus says, don't hide behind telling yourself that you haven't gone all the way if you're very comfortable being on that path. To whom will your appetites bow? That's the real question here. And in so many of the discussions of the Sermon on the Mount and how we should live anyway, to whom will your appetites bow? Will you and I work to beat our bodies into submission? Will we allow the Spirit the chance to refine our behavior and our desires? Or will we give lust one more chance to catch our eye? None of the above should be a surprise to anyone who is familiar with the ways of godliness. That is to say, if you've read the Bible, if you know how God works, He's never just looking at behavior. He's always looking at the heart and the mind that prompt the behavior. It's so true that why we do something is often just as important, if not more important, than what we actually do. And Jesus here is looking at the heart and the mind that is behind the adulterous activity. God has never been content with just the actions of the body, but He also desires to redeem the mind and the heart of the believer. In the last section, beginning in verse 29, he says, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. where it's better to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you should lose one of your members than that your whole body should go to hell. This is a kind of language that we call hyperbole. It's a kind of measured exaggeration or overstatement that's designed to draw attention to a specific point that the speaker is making. And very few students of Scripture historically have looked at this passage literally, but there have been some. There have been some that have taken the words of Jesus so seriously and felt that for their own life and for their own discipleship, they've had to take a gouge to their eye and some kind of blade to their hand and dismembered themselves and disfigured themselves, saying it's worth that price to be right with God. And just because I'm telling you that, in my view, this is hyperbole, that Jesus is making an overstatement to drive home his point as a figure of speech, that doesn't mean that we're free to brush it under the rug or knock it behind the desk and somehow ignore or minimize what Jesus is saying. I think it's fair to see this principle in his language, in what he says. It's better to sacrifice the indulgence of an appetite than it is to sacrifice our dedication to the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. It's better to sacrifice the indulgence of your appetite. There are worse things than celibacy, is another way to say this. Now, the first sin that we read about in the Bible, you remember Eve taking that apple from the tree, I say apple, that fruit from the tree, and she passes it to Adam. It really plays out this exact same way of what Jesus is warning us here in Matthew chapter 5. Read with me from Genesis chapter 3. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was delight to the eye, and she saw that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. It looked good. Eve shouldn't have been around the tree to begin with. God had already warned her, but it looked good. And once she had looked, she didn't feel like she could turn away, so she turned back for a second look and a third until it looked good for food, and she reached out to touch it. And just a look, just a touch won't hurt, but the look led to the touch, and the touch led to the eating. And on the day that you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. Were the words ringing in her ear, or was she by that time plugging her ears and saying, no, not me, it'll be different, I can control this? It stirred her appetite for the food. She gave in and she ate. This is no different. Yet you and I are not called to reflect the fallenness of humanity or the world around us, but the holiness and the nobility of God, what we see in him when we see him as he is. So I want to read to you from Colossians chapter 3 as we end this. Since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life that you once lived, but now you must rid yourselves of all things such as these. Now, the Bible is very clear that you fix your mind above, where Christ is seated with God, and the things of this earth simply fall out of view. It's that easy. Where's your mind? Is it in this gutter of a world, or is it fixed on Jesus. Things to think about, things to contemplate, certainly things to pray about together. God bless.